and welcome to In the Weeds, a gardening podcast brought to you by Maple Marsh Farm, growing good vegetables in season locally on Amherst Island. Currently closed for the season, but working on big plans for Garden 2021. I'm Terry McGinn, your host for In the Weeds, where I offer advice, information, and garden stories from my more than 30 years of growing experience. It's November. Holy smokes, how did that happen? We here in the Great Lakes region have had our first below freezing nights, and I'm in a bit of a frantic mode to redo some of the flower beds around the house. I've picked 3 that I'm going to redo this fall, and it's been, I would say, probably 10 years, maybe 15 years for a couple of them since they've been refreshed. And so I think it's kind of important to jump on that and do that now. You know, you have things that you try, you've planted something in a spot and it didn't really work out. So you decide to move it. In one of the flower beds right at the front of the house, we have this really beautiful little plant with speckled leaves and these tiny little white flowers on it that is so lovely, but that you can't see from the road. And there's no walkway past there. There's no door near there. There's no real way to see this plant unless you're standing right on top of it. So it's one of the ones that needs to be moved just because it grows well in that spot, but really doesn't get enjoyed. So it just, you know, those kinds of things need to be done. I bought a whole bunch of bulbs and corms and tubers to plant, and now I have to get them in the ground. And I'll be honest, the cold did me a little bit of a favor, though, because the flowers that are in the beds that I want to redo are still, or were still blooming and were beautiful until we had our first really cold night. So now I feel a lot less guilty about like tearing them up and redoing the flower bed because I don't have to be the one to have killed them. The cold took care of that for me. So let's jump right into some questions, and we'll go from there. So the first question comes from Janet, and she says, my dahlia bulbs dried up and wrinkled last winter. How should I have wintered them safely? One of my main takeaways when it comes to overwintering things like dahlia bulbs is to treat them kind of like a potato. And one of the things that you do when you put a potato away for the winter is that you cure it. And so you want to make sure that it's clean and you want to make sure that it's dry. Those are kind of the main things. And the curing process after you've cleaned it and after you've dried it is to lay the tubers out and just let them sit. In the case of a dahlia bulb, unlike a potato, you would do that in a sunny location, like a sunny south-facing window would be a great spot, and leave them for a couple of weeks. So if you've got a mudroom or something like that, Janet, that you could put your dahlia bulbs in, that would be a great place, or just an upstairs bedroom or someplace where it might have some spot where you can let them cure away for a couple of weeks. And then store them in a cardboard box with like sort of layers of newspaper in between. That's a tip that I learned many years ago from a local island gardener who taught me a lot about, specifically about overwintering things, named Marion Glenn. And so a lot of the wisdom that I have from that kind of side of gardening comes from her. And anytime that you hear me talk about these kinds of ideas, most of them originally came to me from Marion, and I found mostly everything that she's told me in the past has been a winner as far as that advice goes. One of the things that I think is really important when you put away things like your dahlia bulbs, or if you're storing geraniums over the winter, or if it's gladioluses, is to just take some time and check on them periodically, just to make sure that in case there is anything that's rotting or that isn't taking that process as well, you have time to sort of intervene and correct any kind of problems if there's too much moisture, or if something is sprouting because it's in a spot that's too warm or whatever, that you'll be able to ensure that you can get ahead of that in time. So our next question comes from Janelle, and she asks, can you grow tomatoes indoors over the winter? And the answer to this one is yes, but. And so the next few questions are also going to be a yes, but answer. So the yes, but means yes, you can, but you have to have the right conditions. You have to make your tomato happy in order to be able to thrive over the winter. So the important thing to be able to have for a tomato keeping it over the winter is either just a super bright window, like the brightest of bright south-facing windows, or supplemental light. And for most of us, that's going to mean having some supplemental light that we can use to give our tomato the edge that it requires to grow and thrive through the winter. So when you're looking for supplemental light, one of the nice things about the new LED bulbs that have come out is that they are cheap and very bright, and you can get them in a wide range of color temperatures. So what you're looking for is something that's 6,500 kelvins, or it'll be 6,500 K, or even a daylight version is what you're looking for, and that will give you the right kind of light for your tomatoes, and you want as much light as possible. So getting a couple of lights or just a really bright singular light is huge. And then when you're growing it, just recognize the fact that light diffuses quickly. So if your light has any kind of a cover on it, you'll want to take that light off so that you can see the bare LEDs to be able to give that maximum amount of light exposure to your plant. And then also keep it very close to the plant because that intensity of light will fall off quickly from a distance. And then once you are growing your plant, once you've chosen a pot, and I usually recommend around a 12 or 14 inch pot for growing a tomato indoors, you want to be able to have lots of room for those tomato roots to grow. And tomato roots are fairly aggressive when they grow. So that's the size of a pot that you're going to want to look at. And you're going to want to use potting soil, not soil from your garden, because soil from your garden will compact in a way that will be detrimental to the root growth of the plant. The other final consideration is pollination, because anytime that you're growing something like a fruit indoors, you're going to need to replace the normal pollinators that come with a plant growing outside. And so one of the ways that tomatoes kind of help you along in this is that almost all tomato plants or tomato flowers are pollinated before the flower opens. So one of the nice things about this is that all you really need to do is provide a vibration to the plant, because that's what pollinates them sort of outside. And my best method for pollinating tomato plants grown indoors is a toothbrush, an electric toothbrush, and just rub the electric toothbrush against the flower for a few seconds, and that'll be more than enough to pollinate the flowers. So just keep an old one and just use it for pollinating your tomato plants. Becky says, I bought mini sweet peppers at the grocery store. If I save the seeds and start them, will they germinate and give me my own mini peppers? Of course, the answer, as we know, to this is going to be yes, but you can grow them and you will get mini peppers. The but here comes from the fact that the ones that you get from the store are probably hybrids. So they will be similar but not identical to the mother plant. You're going to get peppers. They're going to be tasty. And in most cases, they'll probably be mini. You might find that they're slightly different shape from the ones that you get, or they could have different colors to them than the ones that you get. Most of the time, that hybridization is for the growing area, for the growing style that the peppers would have been grown under, most likely in a hot house, grown close together, sometimes trellis, those kinds of things. So those are the variations that you're apt to see in some of the things that you grow from a store-bought pepper. But I do it all the time in my own gardens. And what you get from this is that over the span of a few seasons, from selecting seeds from the ones that do the best and that provide you with the best peppers, you can create sort of your own sort of stable versions of those mini peppers. But absolutely, it's a great experiment, especially if you've got an extra little bit of space in your garden to be able to try those things. I do it all the time, and the results are always fun and often interesting. Sharon asks, how do I take a lilac cutting and grow a bush? So lilacs are pretty easy to grow from a cutting. A few of the important things to keep in mind when you're doing a cutting from basically any kind of a plant, especially a woody stemmed plant, is that you want the youngest growth you possibly can. You're going to have the most success with taking a cutting from young, new growth. And then you just take and stick that into even wet earth, in most cases, will be enough to root your lilac. The important thing to think about is to get at least a few leaf nodes, and you can see them when you look at the plant. You'll see those spots where a leaf or what it looks like a branch would come off of. And make sure that those are under the ground, because that's in most cases where your roots are going to come out of. So you just want to keep that in mind when you're taking and preparing your cuttings. If you have any trouble rooting in raw earth with lilacs or with a lot of other woody stemmed plants, one of the things that I use that really helps to stimulate root growth in those cuttings is what's called willow water. If you have a willow tree on your property, or if you've seen a willow tree grow, you'll notice that the young growth on a willow tree, that year's growth is yellow, is that yellow stemmed, very flexible material, very flexible wood. And so if you take those pieces, those yellow pieces, and cut some off of a tree and then cut them up into little bits and soak them in water, put them in, say, a mason jar of water or a bucket of water, and just let those pieces soak. And as they soak, they release salicylic acid and indole-butyric acid, I think that's the name of it, into the water. And then you can use that water as your medium for rooting your plants in. So you take your cuttings and you soak them in this water that you've created from soaking these bits of willow in them. Sorry, I should say that you take the willow out of them before you use the water. You can also use that to water as your watering medium, like pour that water into plants that are being rooted in earth if you want to help encourage rooting. So that's just the willow water thing is just a really good sort of at-home solution to rooting hormones that you can buy in the store. And that works really well. And then depending on whether you've rooted in water or not, if you've rooted in water, you want to watch. And once the roots of your cutting sort of start to press against the glass or the sides of whatever it is that you're rooting in, I usually use a mason jar, then it would be time to transplant your cutting out into whatever you want it to grow in, whether it's into the ground or whether it's into a pot. Sometimes it's nice to take an intermediate step and transplant into a pot first, especially if you think that the final location for your lilac bush is someplace that might be a little on the harsh side. That intermediate step can help to harden the plant off and get it a more robust root system and to develop just a better root ball and mass that gets put into the ground at a later date. One of the things that is important is that rooting woody stemmed plants can sometimes take a while, so it's worth being patient and not expecting results in the first week or even the first, say, 3 weeks, to really leave that rooting in there, your cutting in there to root, and trust the process that it will happen. And then, enjoy your lilac bush. Thanks for the question, Sharon. So those are our questions for this week, and I want to thank Janet, Janelle, Becky, and Sharon for sending in their questions. Those are really great questions, and they're very timely for this time of the season and the things that we're thinking of now as we move into the middle of November. This has been In the Weeds podcast, coming to you from Maple Marsh Farm. You can find out more about Maple Marsh Farm at maplemarsh.ca. Don't forget to sign up for the newsletter for regular updates and special deals during the growing season. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and tune in next week when we talk about self-seeding herbs that will come back year after year, and whether to cut your perennials and which ones you should and shouldn't cut, and whether there's still time to transplant things before winter. As always, you can ask your own questions in the comments to have them answered in an upcoming episode of the podcast. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.